Imagine being just 17 years old, forced to watch two men die simply because they tried to escape. For Walter Rosenberg, Auschwitz wasn't just a prison. It was a place where freedom seemed impossible to grasp. But what if he could prove everyone wrong? At just 17, in July of 1994, Walter and thousands of others were forced to witness the brutal public hanging of two prisoners who had tried and failed to escape. The SS men marched in with their guns and set up two mobile execution platforms. As the condemned men were brought out, a fellow prisoner, acting as an enforcer for the SS, tied them up and placed ropes around their necks. Everyone had to watch in silence for a full hour as the lifeless bodies swayed in the wind. Pinned to their chests were signs that read, "Because we tried to escape." This is the most extraordinary Holocaust story that you will ever hear. The Nazis wanted Walter and the other prisoners to believe that escape was impossible, but Walter saw things differently. The real danger, he realized, wasn't in trying to escape, it was in failing. However, from that moment on, he was determined to succeed. Walter knew he couldn't do it alone. He became a student of escape, learning from experienced prisoners like a tough Red Army captain. Over time, he built connections with the underground resistance, gathering the skills and knowledge that he would need for the seemingly impossible. Little did Walter know, his journey was just the beginning. But his goal wasn't to save his own life. He had found out the horrible truth about Auschwitz. Its horrors were built on a terrible lie, one that he was determined to expose to the world. When Walter arrived at Auschwitz, he narrowly avoided the gas chambers, unlike most Jews sent there. Instead, he was kept as a slave worker, surviving for nearly 2 years by pure chance. During that time, he saw almost every part of the Nazis' horrific operation. While he didn't work directly in the gas chambers, he witnessed the brutal process of industrialized murder unfold in front of him. For 10 long months, Walter worked at the Ramp, the platform where trains packed with hopeful souls arrived. It wasn't just about unloading belongings, it was a front row seat to one of the cruelest lies ever told. Walter watched mothers holding their children, eyes filled with hope for a new life, completely unaware that this platform was the final stop. Each time, it broke a part of him, but it also fueled his determination. Someone had to reveal the truth. The Jews who arrived actually believed they were being resettled in the East. They had packed their belongings, bringing along pots, pans, clothes, and even toys for their children, all because they thought they were starting new lives. This belief was reinforced by postcards that they had received from family and friends, postcards that had been written at gunpoint. When the cattle trucks arrived, the SS would sometimes be brutal, forcing people out with no mercy. But on other days, if the time allowed and the weather was good, they would put on an act. They'd pretend the terrible journey was a mistake, something to be corrected. For those from places like Paris or Amsterdam, where people had a high opinion of the Germans, this false kindness made them believe things might get better. When new arrivals at Auschwitz were taken to the killing sites, the Nazis kept up their act. SS men would help the sick climb into the trucks with perfect manners, and those walking were reassured with questions about their jobs and skills. If asked where they were being taken, the SS would calmly reply, "For disinfection," which made sense after the filthy journey. As they walked past the camp, they saw an ambulance trailing behind them, stopping to pick up anyone too weak to walk. But it wasn't what it seemed. The ambulance wasn't for saving lives. It carried the SS doctor who supervised the gas execution, and the cargo was cans of Zyklon B, the deadly gas used to kill. Walter, who worked in the camp, even helped load those canisters at some points. The final stop was a farmhouse-like building, hidden in a peaceful setting with flower beds outside the crematoria. The SS asked prisoners about their trades, pretending that shoemakers, tailors, and other workers were urgently needed. They even made them believe that they were about to bathe and would get food and coffee afterward. To keep up the charade, prisoners were told to tie their shoes together so they wouldn't lose them after their baths. In reality, the Nazis wanted the shoes for German families back home, especially those of murdered children. Even when the prisoners were heading to the gas chambers, they were tricked by the sign on the door which read, "To the baths." The ceilings had fake shower heads, and the gas itself had been altered to hide the smell. It was a carefully planned system to keep victims calm until their last breath. For 10 months, Walter worked on the platform, helping unload people and belongings. Over time, he realized why the Nazis went to such great lengths to keep the Jews in the dark about their fate. If the Jews arriving on those cattle trains knew what awaited them, people would cry, panic, or refuse to line up in neat rows. Some might even try to break free, rush the fences, or fight back. Though they were weak from hunger and thirst, there were thousands of them, outnumbering the SS guards. Even if they couldn't stop the machine of death, they could slow it down. The Nazis had built their entire system on this one principle, that the Jews didn't know what was coming. Like lambs being easily slaughtered when herded, rather than being hunted one by one. Walter saw this every day, and it almost broke him. Some of the other prisoners thought Walter was on the verge of cracking, but just when it seemed like he might fall apart, something ignited within him. Someone had to escape and tell the world what Auschwitz meant, and it meant death. When Walter turned 18, he decided that someone would be him. April 7th, 1944. After months of meticulous preparation and watching others meet their tragic ends, Walter knew it was now or never. Would he succeed where so many had failed? Walter and his friend Vrba-Wetzler, 6 years older than him and from the same small Slavic town as Walter, they were both ready to escape. They met at the agreed spot. Without a word, their comrades gave them the signal. Walter and Fred climbed on top of a woodpile, slipped through a hole prepared by the other would-be escapees, and disappeared into the dark. Their comrades above them then moved the planks back into place. Walter immediately pulled out the maturka, a cheap Soviet tobacco soaked in petrol, which a Red Army captain had told him would repel dogs. Walter wedged it into the cracks between the wooden boards, praying that the captain's advice would work. If it worked, he and Fred could hide under the woodpile for exactly as long as they needed, 3 days and 3 nights. Walter continuously stared at the glow-in-the-dark hands of his watch, resisting the urge to stand up and stretch as time dragged on slowly. It was too risky to move, too dangerous to even speak. At one point, Fred reached out and squeezed his hand. They waited, knowing that freedom, if they survived, was just within reach. At 6 p.m. that Friday, the sirens began to wail. The sirens meant someone was missing from roll call. It was Fred and Walter's cue. The two of them wriggled out of the main space under the woodpile, a hiding place built for 4, and crawled into a narrow passageway, a tighter space just for 2. It was an extra measure for safety. They knew exactly what was coming next. The sounds of nearly 2,000 SS soldiers stomping across the ground, barking orders, and their dogs sniffing for any trace of human life. The search for the missing prisoners had begun, and it wouldn't stop for the next 3 days. Walter and Fred knew this pattern all too well. The SS only guarded the outer part of the camp during the day when prisoners were working. At night, they were herded back inside the inner camp, surrounded by electrified fences. But if someone went missing, the SS would keep up the search for 72 hours. After that, they assumed the escapees had made it beyond the camp's borders, and it would be up to the Gestapo to find them. If Fred and Walter could hide for 3 days, they'd have a chance to escape on the 4th night while the guards pulled back. But surviving those 3 days was the hard part. By Sunday, the SS were still searching. At one point, Fred and Walter overheard 2 German guards standing just a few yards away. The guards started guessing where the prisoners might be hiding. One of them suggested, "What about that pile of wood?" Fred and Walter froze as the Germans climbed onto the woodpile and began taking it apart piece by piece. They grabbed their knives, ready for the worst. Then, out of nowhere, a distraction saved them. Thinking that the prisoners were caught, the two guards scrambled off to investigate, leaving Fred and Walter untouched. Saturday turned into Monday, and the search continued, every minute feeling like an eternity. But then, at 6:30 p.m., they heard the words they were praying for. Posten kette Absehen. It was the order to take down the outer sentry posts. The SS had given up their search. For Fred and Walter, the relief was overwhelming, but their muscles were stiff from lying still for so long. Slowly, they crawled back into the main space, tempted to celebrate, but when they tried to push the wooden boards above them, they wouldn't budge. Panic crept in. Had they sealed themselves into their own grave? They thought lifting the planks would be easy, but the weight of the entire stack pressing down was nearly impossible. Luckily, with a final shove, Fred and Walter managed to lift one of the bottom planks just an inch, enough for them to get a grip and push it sideways. Thanks to the Germans who almost found them, because if they hadn't moved those planks, this probably would have been a failed plan. Exhausted from 3 days of hiding in a cramped hole, they paused to catch their breath. Before moving on, they carefully replaced the boards, covering the tracks and hoping that someone else might one day use the hidden hole to escape, just like they had. Fred and Walter were about to become the first Jews to break out of Auschwitz, and they didn't want to be the last. They headed west, crawling on their stomachs through the grass like soldiers heading to the small birch forest that gave Birkenau its name. Only when they reached the trees did they dare stand. The outer perimeter fence was nothing like the electrified one surrounding the inner camp. No lights, no deadly wires, but they still took no chances. They had to prepare makeshift tools to lift the bottom wire, creating just enough space for them to crawl under. On the other side of the fence, they had to stay close to it, making their way in near silence. Soon, they would see the inner camp in the distance, but they knew better. Beyond those lights stood the crematoria. They took one last look, vowing to never to return. Around 2 a.m., they reached a signpost that said, "Attention, this is Auschwitz concentration camp. Anyone found on these lands will be shot without warning." Finally, they had crossed the boundary of the camp. On April 10, 1994, Fred and Walter had done what no Jew had ever done before, escaped Auschwitz. But their mission had only begun. They had to spread the word about what was happening inside. After returning to their homeland of Slovakia, they wrote a 32-page report detailing the mass murder that happened at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Their story reached some of the most powerful people in the world: Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and even the Pope. The report led to actions that saved 200,000 Jewish lives. In hiding, Walter took on a new name, Rudolf Vrba, which he kept for the rest of his life. He continued to tell the world about the horrors of Auschwitz so that no one would forget what he had witnessed. He lived through many more adventures and escapes, but he never stopped sharing his story, right up until his death in Vancouver in 2006 at the age of 81. Walter Rosenberg's story is one of extraordinary courage and determination. If you were in his position, would you have made the same choice? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's discuss the lessons we can learn from this powerful story. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of remarkable individuals from history.